The sound of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, making Ruby Ross clutch her infant son closer to her chest as she ducked behind the weathered clapboards of the town's only church. Her heart pounded wildly against her ribs, and the baby, sensing her fear, began to whimper. Months of running had led her to this desperate moment, hiding in the shadows as the afternoon sun cast long fingers across the parched earth of Montana Territory, 1878. "Hush now, Ellie," she whispered, pressing her lips against her son's downy head. "We can't let them find us." Ruby peered around the corner of the building, her gaze darting frantically across the town square. She'd been certain someone was following her. She'd developed a sixth sense about such things over the past 3 months. The threadbare carpet bag at her feet contained everything she owned in this world: 2 dresses, a hair brush, a small Bible her mother had given her, and what little remained of the money she'd taken when she fled. The sound of boots crunching on gravel made her breath catch. Ruby pressed herself flat against the weathered wood of the church, praying her son wouldn't cry out again. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate and unhurried. "You can stop running," a deep voice said, much closer than she expected. Ruby gasped, turning to find a tall man standing mere feet away. He wore a faded blue shirt, dusty denims, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The silver badge on his chest caught the fading sunlight. "I'm not going back," Ruby declared, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll die before I let him touch my son." The man stepped forward, and Ruby noticed his eyes were a startling shade of blue against his sun-bronzed skin. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with the weight of the gun holstered at his hip. "Name's Victor Keller," he said, removing his hat. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the nape of his neck. "Town marshal here in Redemption Creek, and I don't believe we've been properly introduced, madam." "I don't have time for pleasantries, Marshal," Ruby replied, adjusting her grip on Ellie. "There's a man looking for us, and if he finds us, Frank Blackburn?" Victor asked, his expression hardening. "Tall fellow, fancy clothes, nasty scar across his right cheek." Ruby felt the blood drain from her face. "You've seen him?" He rode into town this morning asking questions. Victor's gaze traveled to the baby in her arms, said his wife and child had run off, that he was desperate to find them. "I'm not his wife," Ruby spat, "and Ellie isn't his son." Victor studied her face for a long moment. "I figured as much. Men who are worried about their wives and children don't usually carry that much firepower or travel with the kind of men he's got with him." Ruby's knees threatened to buckle beneath her. "Then you understand why we can't stay here." "Actually," Victor said, taking another step forward, "I think this is exactly where you need to stay, at least for now. You don't understand. Frank Blackburn is a dangerous man. He's killed people. He'll kill you too if you get in his way." "Wouldn't be the first time someone's tried," Victor replied with a grim smile. He glanced at the darkening sky. "Night's coming. There's a small room at the back of my office where you and your boy can rest. We can figure out the rest in the morning." Ruby hesitated, years of hard-learned distrust warring with her exhaustion. "How do I know I can trust you?" "You don't," Victor said simply. "But I'm guessing you're out of options, and that little one needs more than a church wall to sleep against tonight." As if on cue, Ellie began to fuss, his tiny face scrunching up in hunger or discomfort. Ruby wasn't sure which. She had been running for so long, constantly looking over her shoulder, never staying in one place long enough to catch her breath. "I told him you and the baby had moved on," Victor added quietly. "Said I'd seen a woman fitting your description board the eastbound stage yesterday morning." Relief and suspicion mingled in Ruby's chest. "Why would you do that?" Victor's expression softened slightly. "I've been marshal in this town long enough to know when something doesn't add up. And the look in that man's eyes when he talked about finding you," he shook his head. "It wasn't love or worry I saw there." Ruby swallowed hard, remembering all too well the cold calculation in Frank's gaze. "He won't believe you, he'll keep looking." "Probably," Victor agreed. "But it might buy us some time, and right now time is what you need most." The baby's fussing turned to full-blown crying, and Ruby bounced him gently, murmuring soothing words that seemed to have little effect. Victor bent down and picked up her carpet bag. My office is just down the street. We can cut through the back alley if you're worried about being seen. Ruby really looked at him, trying to discern his true intentions. His face was weathered, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled more than he frowned, though he wasn't smiling now. There was something solid about him, dependable like the mountains that ringed the valley. "Why help us?" she asked. Victor's gaze dropped to the crying infant. "Because some things are just plain wrong, madam, and a man hunting a woman and her baby like their runaway livestock is one of them." He nodded toward the alley. "Now, if you're coming, we should move before that little one attracts more attention." Ruby took a deep breath and made her decision. "Lead the way, Marshal." They moved swiftly through the gathering dusk, Victor slightly ahead, his posture alert as he guided them through the back ways of Redemption Creek. The town wasn't large, a main street lined with the usual establishments. A general store, saloon, hotel, blacksmith, and a handful of other businesses. Most were closing up for the evening, shopkeepers and workers heading home to their suppers. Victor's office was attached to a small jail at the end of the main street. He led her through a side door into a sparse but tidy space with a desk, a few chairs, and wanted posters adorning the walls. A wood stove in the corner radiated welcome warmth. "Through here," he said, opening a door to reveal a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window shuttered against the night. "It's not much, but it's private." Ruby stepped inside, surprised by the relative comfort. "You live here?" "No, madam. Got a small cabin just outside of town." "This is for witnesses or folks who need a safe place for a night or two." He set her bag down on the floor. "Locks on the inside of the door. I'll be at my desk if you need anything." Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the exhaustion of months on the run seeping into her bones. He had quieted somewhat, but she knew he was hungry. "Thank you, Marshal," Victor nodded. "You should get some rest. Tomorrow we can talk about what happens next." As he turned to leave, Ruby found her voice again. "Ruby," she said. "My name is Ruby Ross." Victor paused at the door. "Well, Miss Ross, welcome to Redemption Creek. For what it's worth, I hope it lives up to its name." After he closed the door, Ruby heard the quiet scrape of a chair as he settled at his desk. She fed Ellie, marveling at the strange turn of events that had led her to this place, to this man who had offered help when so many others had turned her away. For the first time in months, Ruby allowed herself to hope. Not much, just a flicker. But in the gathering darkness, even a flicker seemed like a beacon. The morning light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, waking Ruby from the deepest sleep she'd had in months. For a moment, panic seized her as she tried to remember where she was. Then the events of the previous evening came rushing back: the church, the marshal, the small room behind his office. Ellie stirred beside her, making the soft cooing sounds that signaled he was awake but not yet hungry enough to demand immediate attention. Ruby sat up, running a hand through her tangled auburn hair. She'd slept in her clothes, too exhausted to do more than remove her boots before collapsing onto the bed with Ellie cradled against her. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Miss Ross," Victor's voice came through the wood. "Got some breakfast here when you're ready." Ruby quickly checked her appearance, smoothing her wrinkled dress and attempting to tame her hair with her fingers. "Just a moment," she called. She scooped Ellie up and unlocked the door. The marshal stood outside holding a tray with 2 steaming mugs and a plate of food. "Mrs. Simmons from the cafe sends her regards," he said, nodding toward the tray. "Best biscuits in the territory." Ruby's stomach growled at the smell of fresh food. "That's very kind of her." "Told her I had a special guest," Victor explained, setting the tray on a small table near the window. "She didn't ask questions. Good woman, Mrs. Simmons." Ruby settled Ellie in the crook of her arm and sat down. The biscuits were still warm, served with butter, honey, and slices of ham. The coffee was strong and sweet, just how she liked it. "Thank you," she said, suddenly self-conscious under Victor's watchful gaze. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "You sleep all right, better than I have in a long time," Ruby admitted. "Though I kept expecting to hear him frank bursting through the door," Victor nodded. "He left town yesterday evening, headed east like I suggested, but I don't expect he's gone for good." Ruby broke off a piece of biscuit, the momentary comfort of sleep and warm food dissolving. No, he won't give up that easily. Which brings us to the question of what happens next, Victor said, crossing his arms. You planning to keep running? Ruby looked down at Ali, who was watching her with solemn eyes that sometimes seemed too knowing for his 3 months of life. I don't know what else to do if Frank finds us. Tell me about him, Victor said. The truth this time. Ruby took a deep breath. She hadn't told anyone the full story, always afraid of how much to reveal, of who might be sympathetic to Frank rather than to her. I worked for him, she began. In Helena. He owns the Golden Palace, it's a saloon and other things. She glanced at Victor, but his expression remained neutral. I was a singer there, just a singer, she added hastily. My father died 2 years ago, leaving nothing but debts. I needed the work. Victor nodded for her to continue. Frank took an interest in me. At first I was flattered. He's wealthy, powerful. He can be charming when he wants to be. He gave me gifts, better working hours. Ruby's voice hardened. Then he started to show his true nature, his temper, his possessiveness. The things he expected from me. She shifted Ali to her other arm. When I refused him, he threatened to throw me out on the street. Said no one would hire me once he spread the word that I was damaged goods. I had nowhere else to go, no family left, so I stayed, trying to save enough to leave. Ruby's throat tightened. That's when I met James. He was different from the other men who came to the saloon, kind. We fell in love, started making plans to leave Helena together. She blinked back tears. Frank found out, had James beaten so badly he could barely walk. Told me if I ever tried to leave, he'd do worse. Victor's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. When I found out I was expecting, I knew I had to get away. Frank would have. He would have made me get rid of the baby, or worse, claimed it as his own once it was born, even though it wasn't. Ruby looked down at her son. James helped me escape, gave me all the money he had, put me on a stagecoach in the middle of the night. And James? Victor asked quietly. Ruby shook her head, unable to stop the tears now. Frank's men caught him helping me. I heard they killed him. Left his body in the alley behind the saloon as a message. Victor pushed away from the doorframe, his expression grim. And you've been running ever since. 3 months, Ruby confirmed. Town to town, never staying more than a few days. Ali was born in a boarding house in Butt. The woman who ran it was kind, let me stay an extra week to recover. But then one of Frank's men showed up asking questions, and we had to leave. Victor paced the small room. This Frank Blackburn, he's not just a saloon owner with a mean streak, is he? Ruby hesitated, then shook her head. No. He has connections, businessmen, politicians, even some lawmen. He smuggles things, liquor to the reservations, guns, other things I don't know about. People who cross him tend to disappear, which explains why you didn't go to the law. Would you have believed me? Ruby asked. A saloon singer with no family, no money, against a man like Frank Blackburn? Victor stopped pacing and looked at her directly. Yes, Miss Ross, I believe I would have. The simple conviction in his voice made Ruby's breath catch. She ducked her head, focusing on Ali to hide the emotion welling in her chest. Well, now you know, she said when she had composed herself. And you know why I can't stay here. As soon as Frank realizes I'm not heading east, he'll double back. Victor ran a hand through his hair, considering. You can't keep running forever. What choice do I have? You could stay, he said. Here in Redemption Creek, Ruby laughed bitterly. And what? Wait for Frank to find me, put everyone in this town in danger. Let me worry about that, Victor said. This town has been through its share of trouble. We know how to take care of our own. I'm not one of your own, Ruby pointed out. You could be, Victor replied simply. Town's growing. The school needs a teacher starting in the fall. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house needs help with the cleaning and cooking. And I happen to know Reverend Taylor's wife has been looking for someone with a good singing voice to lead the church choir. Ruby stared at him. You've given this some thought. A slight flush colored Victor's cheeks. Didn't sleep much last night. It's a nice dream, Marshal, but not a practical one. Frank won't just give up and go away. No, Victor agreed. He won't. But maybe it's time someone stood up to him. Ruby shook her head. You don't know what he's capable of. And he doesn't know what I'm capable of, Victor countered. Or this town. Ellie began to fuss, and Ruby automatically rocked him, her mind racing with the possibilities Victor was suggesting, to stop running, to have a home again. It seemed too good to be true, which in her experience meant that it was. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "Take on this kind of trouble for people you just met." Victor was quiet for a long moment. "6 years ago, my sister found herself in a situation not so different from yours. Different circumstances, but the same fear, the same desperation." His blue eyes darkened with memory. "She ran too. I tracked her for months, always one step behind. By the time I found her," he shook his head, "I was too late." "I'm sorry," Ruby said softly. "So am I," Victor replied. "Every day." He straightened, his expression resolute. "But I'm not too late for you and your boy, and I'm not about to let another man like that win." Ruby studied his face, seeing the determination there, the conviction. Something stirred in her chest, a feeling she'd thought dead along with James. Hope, yes, but something more, something she was afraid to name. "I can't ask you to risk your life for us," she said. "You didn't ask." Victor smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. "I offered, but the decision is yours, Miss Ross. Stay or go, I'll help you either way." Ruby looked down at Ellie, who had fallen back asleep, his tiny hand curled around her finger. She thought of the endless road ahead if she chose to keep running, the constant fear, the loneliness. And then she thought of staying, of building a life here, of Ellie growing up in a real home instead of a series of rented rooms. "If I stay," she said slowly, "what's your plan for when Frank returns?" "First, we make sure everyone in town knows the truth about who you are and what he's done," Victor said. "No secrets, no lies that he can use against you. Then we make it clear that you're under the protection of this town." And when that doesn't stop him, Victor's expression hardened. "Then we deal with him once and for all." Ruby felt a chill at his words. "I won't have more blood on my hands, Marshal. Sometimes standing up to men like Frank Blackburn means being willing to use force," Victor said quietly, "but I've never been one to shoot first and ask questions later. We do this legal if we can." Ruby nodded, appreciating his honesty even as she worried about the road ahead. "And if I need to leave quickly, I keep a good horse in the stable behind the office. Fastest in the county, and I know every trail and hideout for 50 miles in any direction." Victor stepped closer, his voice sincere. "I won't let anything happen to you, Orly. That's a promise, Miss Ross." Ruby took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision before her. "All right," she said finally. "We'll stay for now." The relief that crossed Victor's face was almost palpable. "Good, that's good." But Ruby added, "If there's any sign of Frank or his men, any whisper that he's close, we leave immediately. No heroics, no last stands." Victor nodded. "Fair enough." He glanced out the window at the bustling Main Street. "Let's start by getting you settled somewhere more comfortable than a jail cell. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house is clean, quiet, and she's good with children." "I don't have much money left," Ruby admitted. "Certainly not enough for board." "Like I said, she needs help around the place, room and board in exchange for work." Victor smiled again. "And once you're settled, I can introduce you to Reverend Taylor. Sunday service is tomorrow, and I happen to know his wife has been complaining about the state of the church choir for months." For the first time in too long, Ruby felt a genuine smile tug at her lips. "You really have thought of everything, haven't you, Marshal Keller?" "Call me Victor," he said. "And not everything, but I'm working on it." As they prepared to leave the safety of the marshal's office, Ruby couldn't help but wonder if she was making the right choice. Redemption Creek might offer sanctuary, but it could also become a battlefield if Frank discovered her whereabouts. Still, looking at Victor's confident stance as he checked his gun belt and settled his hat on his head, she felt something she hadn't felt since James's death. "Protected? Ready?" Victor asked, holding the door open. Ruby gathered Ellie closer, her carpet bag clutched in her free hand. "Ready as I'll ever be." Mrs. Henderson's boarding house sat on a quiet side street 3 blocks from the marshal's office. It was a 2-story clapboard structure with a wide front porch and window boxes bursting with early summer flowers. As they approached, a plump woman in her 50s emerged from the front door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Marshal Keller," she called cheerfully. "What brings you by this fine morning? Not trouble, I hope." "No trouble, Mrs. Henderson," Victor replied, tipping his hat. "Just looking for a room for Miss Ross and her boy here." The older woman's gaze shifted to Ruby and Ellie, her expression warming. "Oh my, what a beautiful baby. How old is he, dear?" 3 months, Ruby answered, surprised by the woman's immediate friendliness. "Perfect age, all smiles, and not yet mobile enough to get into mischief," Mrs. Henderson said with a laugh. "I'm Beatrice Henderson, but everyone calls me Bea." "Ruby Ross," Ruby replied, "and this is Ellie. Pleasure to meet you both." Bea's sharp eyes took in Ruby's worn dress and the small carpet bag. "I've got a lovely room on the 2nd floor with a morning sun. Used to be my daughter's before she married and moved to Denver." Victor cleared his throat. "Miss Ross is looking for work as well as lodging. I mentioned you might need some help around the place. Did you now?" Bea raised an eyebrow at the marshal, a knowing smile playing around her lips. "Well, you're right about that. This old house keeps me busier than a one-armed paper hanger, especially with 5 boarders to feed and clean up after." She turned to Ruby. "Can you cook, dear?" "Yes, madam," Ruby nodded, "and I can clean, mend, do laundry, whatever's needed. Good with figures. My ledgers are in a terrible state. I kept the books for my father's store before he passed," Ruby offered. Bea clapped her hands together. "Wonderful, room and board in exchange for help with the cooking, cleaning, and bookkeeping. We can work out the details as we go." She glanced at Ellie. "The baby's welcome too, of course. I've got a cradle in the attic that my grandchildren use when they visit." Ruby felt overwhelmed by the woman's generosity. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Henderson." "Bea," the woman corrected, "and kindness has nothing to do with it. Good help is hard to find in these parts, especially since the railroad started hiring all the able-bodied young women for their Harvey houses." She waved them toward the house. "Come along, I'll show you your room." Victor hung back. "I've got rounds to make, but I'll check in later." "Thank you," Ruby said softly, "for everything." Something passed between them, an understanding, a connection that made Ruby's heart beat a little faster despite her best intentions. "Just doing my job, Miss Ross," Victor replied, but his eyes told a different story. He tipped his hat again and headed back toward the main street. Bea watched this exchange with interest, but said nothing as she led Ruby inside. The boarding house was clean and well-maintained, with polished wooden floors and simple, comfortable furnishings. A delicious smell wafted from the kitchen at the back of the house. "Stew for tonight's supper," Bea explained. "Boarders get breakfast and dinner included, lunch they fend for themselves. Most work in town, though Mr. Peterson upstairs is retired from the railroad, keeps to himself mostly." She led Ruby up a well-worn staircase to a room at the end of the hallway. It was small but charming, with a brass bed, a dresser with a mirror, a small desk, and a rocking chair near the window that overlooked a garden at the back of the property. Washrooms at the end of the hall, shared with the other boarders. Hot water on Tuesdays and Saturdays for bathing, but there's always warm water for washing up. Bea opened a window to let in the fresh air. "I'll have the cradle brought up before nap time." Ruby set her bag down, feeling almost dizzy with the sudden change in her circumstances. Just 24 hours ago, she'd been on another dusty stage heading nowhere in particular, just away from the shadows that pursued her. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Bea waved away her gratitude. "Might want to wait until you've seen the kitchen on a Saturday night before you thank me," she chuckled. "Now, I'll let you get settled. Lunch is cold ham and bread in the kitchen if you're hungry. We serve dinner at 6 sharp." After Bea left, Ruby sat on the edge of the bed, Ellie still in her arms. The mattress was softer than anything she'd slept on in months, the room cleaner and more welcoming than she could have hoped for. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered to her son. "Shall we stay a while?" Ellie blinked up at her, his tiny face solemn as though considering the question. Then he broke into a gummy smile that made Ruby's heart swell. "I'll take that as a yes," she said, kissing his forehead. As she began to unpack her meager belongings, Ruby allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, that this might work. That Redemption Creek might truly offer the fresh start she so desperately needed. That Victor Keller might be the rare kind of man who kept his promises. It was a dangerous hope. But sitting in the sunlit room with her son in her arms and the sound of birds in the trees outside, Ruby decided it was a risk worth taking. The following morning, Ruby woke to the unfamiliar sound of church bells. For a moment, she lay still, listening to their clear, resonant tones echoing across the town. Ellie, stirred beside her in the cradle, Bee had provided a beautifully crafted piece that the older woman had claimed belonged to her own children decades ago. Ruby had spent the previous day settling into the boarding house, helping Bee with the evening meal and meeting the other boarders, Mr. Peterson, the retired railroad man, the Cooper sisters, who ran the millinery shop on Main Street, and young Dr. Morgan, who had recently taken over the town's medical practice. All had been welcoming, asking few questions about her past, seemingly content with the simple explanation that she was a widow looking for a fresh start. Only Bee had pulled her aside later in the evening, her expression serious. "The marshal stopped by while you were putting the baby down," she had said. "Told me a bit more about your situation, not everything, I suspect, but enough." Ruby had tensed, waiting for the judgment or the request to leave. Instead, Bee had patted her hand. "I lost my William to a man with a temper and too much whiskey in him. Different circumstances, but the same result, a woman alone with more troubles than help." Her eyes had softened. "You're safe here, child, and that baby of yours too." Now, as Ruby dressed for church in her best dress, faded blue calico, worn at the cuffs but still presentable, she thought about Bee's words. Safety had seemed like an impossible luxury for so long that she hardly knew what to do with the feeling. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Ruby. "Be called. The marshal's here to escort us to church." Ruby's heart quickened as she opened the door to find Victor standing in the hallway, dressed in what was clearly his Sunday best, a dark suit, crisp white shirt, and string tie. He'd trimmed his hair and beard, and without his usual hat, he looked younger, less weathered. "Good morning, Miss Ross," he said, his eyes warming as they fell on Ellie in her arms. "And good morning to you too, young man." "Good morning, Marshal," Ruby replied, suddenly self-conscious of her simple dress and the quick braid she'd fashioned her hair into. "You didn't need to come all this way. Church is just down the street," Victor pointed out, "and I promised to introduce you to Reverend Taylor and his wife." Bee appeared behind him, resplendent in a burgundy dress and matching hat. "The marshal is being modest. He doesn't usually attend services unless there's a special occasion." Victor cleared his throat. "I try to maintain good relations with all the establishments in town, Mrs. Henderson." "The church included." "Of course you do," Bee replied with a knowing smile. She adjusted her hat. "Shall we? I like to get a good seat near the front." The small party made their way down the stairs and out into the bright morning. Redemption Creek on a Sunday had a different feel, quieter, more dignified. Families walked together toward the white clapboard church at the end of the main street, the same church where Ruby had hidden just 2 days earlier. Victor offered his arm to Ruby as they walked. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, balancing Ellie in her other arm. The baby was alert, his eyes wide as he took in the unfamiliar sights and sounds. "Sleep all right?" Victor asked. "Better than expected," Ruby admitted. "Bee's been very kind. She's a good woman. Lost her husband to a bar fight about 10 years back. Turned that big house into a boarding house to make ends meet." Victor nodded to a passing family. "Morning, Thompsons. Is there anyone in this town you don't know?" Ruby asked. Victor smiled. "Occupational hazard, small town, long memory." He glanced down at her. "Speaking of which, people will talk about why the marshal is suddenly escorting a pretty widow to church." Ruby felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I suppose that's unavoidable." "It might work in our favor," Victor said thoughtfully. "If word gets back to Blackburn that you've found protection here." The implication hung in the air between them. Ruby wasn't sure how to respond. Part of her recoiled at the idea of using Victor as a shield. It felt too close to the relationship Frank had tried to impose on her. But another part recognized the practicality of it. "I won't have you risking your reputation on my account," she said finally. Victor's expression turned serious. "My reputation can handle it, Miss Ross. The question is, can yours?" Before Ruby could answer, they arrived at the church steps. Reverend Taylor, a tall, thin man with kind eyes, stood greeting his congregation. "Marshal Keller," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Reverend," Victor nodded. "I'd like to introduce you to Miss Ruby Ross and her son, Illy. They're new to town." The Reverend's eyes crinkled warmly. "Welcome to Redemption Creek, Miss Ross. We're delighted to have you join us this morning." "Thank you, Reverend," Ruby replied. "It's been some time since I've attended a service." "The Lord's house is always open," he assured her. His gaze lingered briefly on the way she held Victor's arm, but he made no comment. "Please come in. My wife will be thrilled to meet you." The interior of the church was simple but beautiful, with polished wooden pews, clear glass windows that let in the morning light, and a modest altar. Nearly every seat was filled, and Ruby felt the weight of curious gazes as Victor led her to a pew near the middle of the congregation. As they sat, Victor leaned close to whisper, "Small towns run on gossip. By noon, everyone will know who you are. By dinner, they'll have decided whether you're here to steal their husbands or bake pies for the harvest festival." Despite her nervousness, Ruby couldn't help but smile. "And which would you prefer?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, more flirtatious than she had intended. Victor's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, Ruby saw something there that made her breath catch. "I've never been much for pies," he murmured, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Before Ruby could respond, the organ began to play, signaling the start of the service. She faced forward, her cheeks warm, aware of Victor's solid presence beside her and the curious glances from those around them. The service was familiar and comforting hymns she remembered from her childhood, readings from Scripture, Reverend Taylor's thoughtful sermon on new beginnings and second chances. Throughout, Illy remained surprisingly quiet, content to observe the proceedings with solemn attention. After the final hymn, as the congregation began to file out, a slender woman with silver-streaked dark hair approached them. "Marshal Keller," she said warmly. "What a wonderful surprise." "Mrs. Taylor," Victor replied, standing. "May I introduce Miss Ruby Ross and her son, Illy?" Martha Taylor's smile was genuine as she extended her hand to Ruby. "My husband mentioned we had a new face in the congregation. Welcome to Redemption Creek, my dear." "Thank you," Ruby said. "It was a lovely service. The marshal tells me you have a beautiful singing voice, Mrs." Taylor continued, her eyes lighting up. "Our choir is in desperate need of someone who can carry a tune. Most of us are enthusiastic but not particularly gifted." Ruby shot Victor a surprised look. "The marshal is too kind. I used to sing, yes, but it's been some time." "Nonsense, Mrs." Taylor waved away her modesty. "Talent doesn't fade from disuse. We practice on Wednesday evenings. I do hope you'll join us." Before Ruby could formulate a polite refusal, Victor spoke up. "Miss Ross has a remarkable voice, Mrs. Taylor. I'm sure the choir would benefit greatly from her expertise." Martha beamed. "Then it's settled. Wednesday at 7, and bring this handsome young man. Several of the ladies would be delighted to take turns holding him while you sing." As Mrs. Taylor moved on to greet other parishioners, Ruby turned to Victor. "A remarkable voice. You've never even heard me sing." "Haven't I?" Victor replied cryptically. At her confused expression, he elaborated, "The night before you arrived in town, I was passing through Helena on business. Stopped at the Golden Palace. Heard a young woman with auburn hair sing Beautiful Dreamer like an angel." Ruby stared at him. "That was you, in the back corner," Victor nodded. "Never expected to see you again, especially not hiding behind our church, but I recognized you right away." "You knew who I was all along," Ruby realized. "You knew I had worked for Frank." "I knew you had sung at his establishment," Victor corrected. "And I knew the look of a woman running scared, the rest. Well, you filled in those blanks yourself." Ruby wasn't sure whether to be angry at his omission or relieved that he had known part of her story from the beginning and still chosen to help her. "You should have told me," she said finally. "Would you have trusted me if I had?" Victor asked. "If I'd said I recognized you from Blackburn's saloon," Ruby considered this. "Probably not," she admitted. "That's why I didn't mention it." Victor offered his arm again as they began to make their way out of the church. "For what it's worth, I only heard you sing that one song." Left right after had an early stage to catch the next morning. As they stepped into the sunlight, Ruby found herself surrounded by curious townspeople, all eager to meet the newcomer who had arrived on the marshal's arm. Victor made the introductions smoothly, his hand occasionally coming to rest reassuringly at the small of her back. Ruby did her best to remember names and faces, to smile and answer the polite questions about where she had come from and how long she planned to stay. Most seemed to accept the simplified version of her story, a young widow with a baby looking for a fresh start. Only when an older man with a weathered face and sharp eyes asked, "Ross, any relation to the Ross family from Helena?" did Ruby falter. "No, sir," she answered, her grip tightening involuntarily on Ollie. "No family there." The man introduced as Judge Wilson, retired, studied her with an intensity that made Ruby nervous. "Thought I recognized you from somewhere," he mused. "Must be mistaken." Victor smoothly intervened. "Judge Wilson used to ride circuit all over the territory, knows more faces than most of us will see in a lifetime." The judge grunted acknowledgement, but continued to watch Ruby with unsettling interest as Victor guided her away. "He knows," Ruby whispered once they were out of earshot. "He's been to the Golden Palace, I can tell." "Maybe," Victor conceded, "but Wilson's no friend to Frank Blackburn, had a run-in with him years ago over a land dispute. If he recognizes you, he's more likely to help than hinder." Ruby wasn't convinced if he mentions seeing me to anyone. "He won't," Victor assured her. "Wilson's retired, but he still has a judge's discretion, and he's smart enough to read between the lines when the town marshal brings a mysterious woman to church." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. By the time Victor escorted Ruby and Bee back to the boarding house, Ruby felt exhausted but oddly hopeful. The people of Redemption Creek had been welcoming, seeming to take their cues from Victor's obvious approval of her. At the boarding house steps, Bee tactfully excused herself, mentioning something about checking on the Sunday roast. "Thank you for this morning," Ruby said once they were alone. Illy had fallen asleep against her shoulder, his small weight comforting. "For everything, really." Victor removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "You're doing well here, Ruby, people like you." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent an unexpected warmth through her. "They like that you like me," she corrected him. "I'm not naive, Victor. Your approval carries weight in this town." He smiled slightly at her use of his name. "Maybe at first, but you'll earn their trust on your own soon enough." He glanced at the sleeping baby. "Both of you will." Ruby wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she could build a real life here, that she and Ellie could belong somewhere again. But the shadow of Frank Blackburn hung over everything, a constant reminder that her peace was temporary at best. "What if the judge recognizes me?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "What if someone else does? I can't put these people in danger, put you in danger when Frank comes looking for me again." Victor stepped closer, his expression serious. "Ruby, look around you. This town has survived floods, fires, outlaws, and the worst winter in living memory. These aren't soft city folk, they're survivors, and they protect their own." "But I'm not, you are," he interrupted firmly. "The moment you decided to stay, you became one of us, and we take care of our own." The conviction in his voice nearly undid her. Ruby blinked back sudden tears, overwhelmed by his certainty, by the promise of belonging he was offering. "I should get Ellie inside," she said, her voice unsteady. Victor nodded, stepping back. "I've got some business to attend to this afternoon, but I'll stop by this evening to check on you both." "You don't have to, I know," he said simply. "I want to." As he walked away, Ruby watched him, trying to reconcile the man before her with her experience of men like Frank Blackburn. Victor Keller was everything Frank was not: honest, direct, respectful. It was dangerous, she knew, to let herself trust again, to hope for something more than survival. But watching Victor disappear around the corner, his confident stride and straight shoulders a picture of dependability, Ruby couldn't help the small flutter of something like happiness in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, Redemption Creek would live up to its name after all. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm that Ruby hadn't experienced since before her father's death. Each morning, she rose early to help Bea prepare breakfast for the boarders. The work was satisfying, kneading bread dough, frying bacon, brewing coffee strong enough to put hair on a man's chest, as Bea liked to say. After breakfast, while the boarders went about their daily business, Ruby would tend to the household accounts, amazed at how Bea had managed to keep the place running with such haphazard bookkeeping. In the afternoons, she cleaned rooms, mended linens, or watched the house while Bea ran errands in town. Ellie thrived in the stable environment. He began to sleep through the night, much to Ruby's relief, and his smiles came more frequently. Bea doted on him shamelessly, often taking him for an hour or two so Ruby could have a moment to herself. Victor visited daily, sometimes just for a few minutes, other times staying for supper when Bea insisted. Ruby found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. There was something about the way Victor looked at her with respect and growing affection, but never expectation or demand that healed something broken inside her. On Wednesday evening, true to her word to Mrs. Taylor, Ruby attended choir practice at the church. She had been nervous, worried that her voice would fail her or that she would be reminded too strongly of her performances at the Golden Palace. But the simple hymns and the genuine enthusiasm of the other choir members, most of whom lacked any formal training but sang with heartfelt devotion, had been nothing like the rowdy atmosphere of Frank's saloon. "You have a gift," Martha Taylor had told her afterward. "A true gift from God." The compliment had brought unexpected tears to Ruby's eyes. For so long, her voice had been just another commodity to be exploited, another aspect of herself that didn't fully belong to her. But here, in this small church with these kind people, it felt like something sacred again. By Friday evening, just 1 week since her arrival in Redemption Creek, Ruby began to believe that perhaps this fresh start was real. She was preparing supper with Bea, laughing at the older woman's colorful commentary on the latest town gossip, when a commotion from the front of the house caught their attention. "Sounds like Mr. Peterson dropping his boots again," Bea remarked, wiping her hands on her apron. "That man stomps around like he's still signaling trains." But when the kitchen door swung open, it wasn't the retired railroad man who entered, but Victor. His expression was grim, his posture tense in a way Ruby hadn't seen before. "Victor?" she asked, her hand instinctively going to the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "What's wrong?" "Got word from a friend in Helena," he said without preamble. "Blackburn's on the move. Someone saw a woman matching your description in Great Falls. He's headed that way now, but it won't take him long to realize it's a false lead." Ruby's blood ran cold. "How long do we have?" "A few days, a week at most." Victor glanced at Bea. "Mrs. Henderson, would you mind giving us a moment?" Bea looked between them, concern etched on her kind face. "Of course, Marshal. I'll just check on Ollie. He should be waking from his nap soon." After she left, Victor moved closer to Ruby, his voice low and urgent. "We need to be ready when he comes. I've sent telegrams to some contacts in the territorial marshal's office, but they can't get here in time to be much help." Ruby set the knife down with trembling hands. "I knew this would happen. I should leave Takeley and go west, maybe try to reach California." "And spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder?" Victor shook his head. "No, it ends here." "I won't have you or anyone else in this town getting hurt because of me," Ruby insisted. Victor's expression softened slightly. "That's not your decision to make, Ruby. People here have already decided you're worth protecting." "They don't even know me." "They know enough," he interrupted, "and they've seen enough of you this past week to make up their minds." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Ruby had come to recognize as a sign of his frustration. "Judge Wilson came to see me this morning." Ruby tensed. "He did recognize me." "Yes," Victor confirmed. "Said he was in Helena for a legal matter last year, stopped in at the Golden Palace one evening and heard you sing." "And," Ruby prompted, bracing herself for the worst. "And he asked how he could help," Victor said simply. "Said he'd had his own run-ins with Blackburn over the years, knew what kind of man he was. Offered to use his connections with the territorial governor if needed." Relief washed over Ruby, followed quickly by disbelief. "Just like that?" He believes in me without even hearing my side of the story. He heard enough, Victor replied, and he's not the only one. Reverend Taylor, Dr. Morgan, even old Peterson, they've all offered to help if trouble comes. Ruby sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed. I don't understand. Why would they do this for a stranger? Victor took the chair opposite her, his eyes serious. Because that's what community means, Ruby. It's not just about living in the same place. It's about standing together when one of you is threatened. I've never had that, she admitted softly. Not since my father died. Well, you have it now, Victor said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the touch sending a warm current up her arm, and so does Ali. Ruby looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between his sun-darkened skin and her paler fingers. She thought about how much had changed in just 1 week, how she had gone from running in terror to sitting in a warm kitchen with a man who looked at her like she mattered, like she was worth fighting for. What's your plan? She asked finally, turning her hand to grip his. When Frank comes. Victor's fingers tightened around hers. First, we don't hide. Hiding makes you look guilty, gives him power over the narrative. You go about your business as usual, choir practice, helping B, walking in town. With an escort, I assume. With me, Victor confirmed. Or Judge Wilson or Reverend Taylor, someone will be with you at all times. And Ellie? B has already volunteered to keep him here with the Cooper sisters as backup. If there's trouble, they have a root cellar with a hidden exit that leads to the creek bed. Victor's expression was deadly serious. But it won't come to that, Ruby wasn't convinced. You don't know Frank like I do. He won't just give up because a small-town marshal tells him to. I'm counting on that, Victor said grimly. Men like Blackburn are used to getting their way through intimidation and violence. They don't know how to handle a fair fight where the odds aren't stacked in their favor. And you think you can give him a fair fight? Ruby asked skeptically. Frank travels with at least 3 men hired guns who enjoy their work. Which is why we'll be ready for them, Victor assured her. This isn't my first rodeo, Ruby. Before I was marshal here, I rode with the Montana regulators. We dealt with men worse than Blackburn. Ruby had heard of the regulators, a semi-official force that had helped bring law to the territory in the early days, before proper marshals and sheriffs were established in every town. They had a reputation for being effective, if sometimes brutal in their methods. I don't want a bloodbath, she said quietly, especially not one with my name on it. Neither do I, Victor replied. Best case scenario, Blackburn backs down when he sees he's outnumbered and outmatched. Worst case, we do what needs to be done. The matter-of-fact way he spoke of potential violence should have frightened Ruby. Instead, she found it oddly reassuring. Victor wasn't a man who sought out trouble, but neither was he one to back down from it when it threatened those in his care. All right, she said finally. We do this your way, but promise me something? What's that? Ruby met his gaze steadily. If things go wrong, if it looks like Frank might win, you'll help me and Ellie get away. No heroics, no last stands, just help us escape. Victor was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with her request. I promise, he said eventually, but it won't come to that. The certainty in his voice almost made her believe him. Almost. Thank you, Ruby said, squeezing his hand before releasing it, for everything. Victor stood, his expression softening as he looked down at her. You don't need to thank me, Ruby. Just trust me, trust us. This town, we won't let you down. As he turned to leave, Ruby was struck by the realization that she did trust him in a way she hadn't trusted anyone since James. The thought was terrifying and comforting in equal measure. Victor, she called as he reached the door. When he turned back, she took a deep breath. Be careful. Frank isn't just dangerous because of his men. He's smart, calculating. He finds people's weaknesses and exploits them. Victor nodded, understanding what she was trying to say. I'll bear that in mind. After he left, Ruby remained at the kitchen table, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She had come to care deeply for the people of Redemption Creek in the short time she'd been among them, for Bee's motherly concern, for Martha Taylor's quiet kindness, for the Cooper sisters' cheerful gossip, and for Victor. Especially for Victor, with his steady presence and unwavering support, his gentle smiles when he held Ellie, his obvious delight when she sang at choir practice. Ruby wasn't ready to name the feelings that stirred in her heart whenever he was near, but she couldn't deny their existence. Which made the thought of Frank Blackburn coming to Redemption Creek all the more terrifying. Frank had a talent for destroying anything beautiful, anything pure. He would see her growing attachment to Victor, to this town, and he would use it against her. Ruby rose from the table and moved to the window, gazing out at the peaceful twilight settling over Redemption Creek. For the first time in her life, she had found a place where she might belong, where Ellie might grow up safe and loved. She wouldn't let Frank take that away from her. Not again, not ever. With renewed determination, Ruby returned to preparing supper. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall, not cowering in the shadows, and she wouldn't be standing alone. The warning came on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days after Ruby's arrival in Redemption Creek. She was hanging laundry in the backyard of the boarding house, Ellie dozing in a basket nearby, when Victor appeared at the garden gate. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. "He's coming," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. Victor nodded, entering the yard with purposeful strides. "Got word from the station master in Silver Creek. Blackburn and 4 men got off the train there this morning, asking about stagecoach routes to Redemption." Ruby's hands stilled on the damp sheet she'd been hanging. 4. "He usually travels with 3. Extra hired gun, most likely," Victor said grimly, "which means he's expecting trouble, or planning to cause it," Ruby countered, her throat tight with fear. "How long do we have? Stage from Silver Creek arrives tomorrow around noon." Victor moved closer, his voice dropping despite the privacy of the yard. "Everything's in place. Judge Wilson sent a telegram to the territorial marshal's office. They can't get anyone here in time, but they've authorized me to deputize as needed." Ruby nodded, trying to keep her breathing steady. "Who have you chosen?" Dr. Morgan's handy with a rifle. Peterson was a sharpshooter during the war, the miller's father and son from the ranch outside town, and Reverend Taylor, believe it or not. Ruby raised her eyebrows at this last name. The Reverend, really? A ghost of a smile crossed Victor's face. Before he found God, Taylor rode with the Texas Rangers, still keeps his old Colt in his desk drawer. Despite the gravity of the situation, Ruby found herself smiling back. "It seems I've underestimated the good people of Redemption Creek." "Most folks do," Victor agreed. He glanced at Ellie, his expression softening. "Bees agreed to take him to the Cooper sisters' place tomorrow morning. They live above their shop on the far side of town, away from where any trouble is likely to happen." Ruby nodded, grateful for the precaution even as her heart ached at the thought of being separated from her son during such a dangerous time. "And me? Where do you want me?" Victor hesitated, and Ruby could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. "I'd like to say as far away as possible, but Frank won't believe I've left town unless he sees proof," Ruby finished for him. "And if he doesn't find me, he might hurt innocent people trying to get information." "Exactly." Victor ran a hand through his hair. "I need you visible but protected. Somewhere public enough that Blackburn will come looking, but defensible if things go bad," Ruby considered for a moment. "The church," she suggested. "It's at the end of the main street, has a clear view of anyone approaching, and it would be fitting, wouldn't it?" "Since that's where he first almost found me," Victor nodded slowly. "The church could work, good sight lines, solid walls, multiple exits." He studied her face. "Are you sure about this, Ruby? It's not too late to take Ellie and go. I could have you on the westbound stage tonight." The offer was tempting, so tempting that for a moment Ruby allowed herself to imagine it. Taking Ellie and fleeing, finding some remote corner of the country where Frank might never think to look. But even as the thought formed, she knew it wasn't the answer. She had been running for too long. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "It ends here, one way or another." Relief and something deeper, more personal, flickered in Victor's eyes. "All right then, I'll speak with Reverend Taylor, make the arrangements." Ruby returned to hanging the laundry, her movements mechanical as her mind raced. "Victor," she said after a moment, "there's something you should know about Frank, something that might help." Victor stepped closer, his full attention on her words. "Frank is arrogant," Ruby continued. He believes he's smarter than everyone around him, and usually he's right. But it makes him careless sometimes, overconfident. She secured a pillowcase with a wooden pin. And he has a weakness for theatrics. He'll want to make a show of taking me back to prove his power, to humiliate me. You think he'll want an audience, Victor surmised. Ruby nodded. He won't just sneak in and grab me. He'll want to do it publicly, make an example of me for daring to run. She swallowed hard. And he'll want to hurt anyone who tried to help me, especially you. Victor's jaw tightened. Let him try. I'm serious, Victor. Frank holds grudges. Even if when this is over, he might come back someday or send someone in his place. And I'll be ready if he does, Victor assured her, his voice softened. Ruby, I understand your concern, but this is my job, protecting this town and everyone in it, including you and Ali. Ruby turned to face him fully, abandoning the laundry. It's more than that, though, isn't it? More than just your job. The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither had yet voiced. Victor held her gaze, and Ruby saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. Yes, he said simply, it's more than that. Ruby's heart hammered against her ribs. I can't ask you to, you didn't ask, Victor interrupted gently. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. I offered, and I'd offer again 100 times over. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The simple touch sent shivers down her spine. I know it's too soon, Victor continued, his voice low. I know you're still healing from everything that happened with James, still running from Blackburn. But when this is over, when you're truly free, I want you to know that there's a place for you here, with me, if you want it. Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes. It was too much, the tenderness in his voice, the sincerity in his gaze, the promise of a future she had stopped believing was possible. Victor, a cry from Ali's basket interrupted whatever she might have said. Both of them turned toward the sound, the moment broken but not forgotten. I should tend to him, Ruby said, wiping at her eyes. Victor nodded, stepping back. Of course, I need to finish making preparations anyway. He moved toward the gate, then paused. Ruby? Yes, you don't need to answer now, just think about staying when this is all over. She nodded, unable to trust her voice with a proper response. Victor seemed to understand. With a final reassuring smile, he left, the garden gate swinging closed behind him. Ruby lifted Ali from his basket, cradling him close as his cries subsided. What do you think, little one? She whispered. Could we make a home here? A real home? Ali gazed up at her with James's dark eyes, his tiny hand wrapping around her finger with surprising strength. In that moment, Ruby allowed herself to really hope for the future Victor had suggested. A life in Redemption Creek, a chance at happiness. But first, they had to face Frank Blackburn. The morning of Frank's expected arrival dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect early summer day that seemed to mock the tension hanging over Redemption Creek. Ruby woke before sunrise, unable to sleep with the knowledge of what lay ahead. She dressed carefully in her best dress, the blue calico she'd worn to church, and braided her hair neatly. Saying goodbye to Ali had been the hardest part. Bee had come for him just after breakfast, cooing reassurances as she bundled him into a basket lined with soft blankets. He'll be safe as houses with the Cooper sisters, she promised, and you'll have him back in your arms by supper time. Ruby had kissed his downy head, breathing in his sweet baby scent. Mama loves you, she whispered, more than anything in this world. Now, as the church clock chimed 11, Ruby sat in the front pew, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Reverend Taylor moved quietly around the altar, arranging hymnals and straightening candles, his movements belying the Colt revolver he wore beneath his black coat. It's not too late to change your mind, he said, pausing in his work. Martha would be happy to take you to the Cooper sisters' place. Ruby shook her head. No, Reverend, this is where I need to be. She glanced toward the door where Victor had stationed himself, watching the street through the window. This ends today. The Reverend studied her with compassionate eyes. The Lord tests us in many ways, Miss Ross, but he never gives us more than we can bear with his help. I hope you're right, Ruby replied. She wasn't sure she shared the Reverend's faith, not after everything she'd been through, but she appreciated the comfort he offered. A tense silence fell over the church as the minutes ticked by. Dr. Morgan was positioned in the bell tower, rifle at the ready. Mr. Peterson and the Millers were strategically placed around the town square, watching for the stage's arrival. At 11:30, Victor moved from his post at the door, crossing to sit beside Ruby in the pew. "Stage is running late," he informed her. "Nothing unusual for this route, but it gives us more time to worry," Ruby finished for him. She looked at his profile, strong and steady in the colored light filtering through the church's modest stained glass. "I'm sorry for bringing this trouble to your door, Victor." He turned to her, his expression softening. "You have nothing to apologize for. The trouble is Blackburn's making, not yours." Ruby managed a small smile. "Still, most men wouldn't consider a woman with my baggage worth the effort." "Then most men are fools," Victor replied simply. He hesitated, then reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "Ruby, about yesterday what I said. I've thought about it," she interrupted softly. "About staying, about us." Victor's eyes searched hers. And before Ruby could answer, the church door burst open. Judge Wilson stood there, his weathered face grim. "Stage is coming," he announced. "Just past the Wilkins place." Victor squeezed Ruby's hand once before releasing it and standing. "How many passengers?" "Driver says 5 men boarded at Silver Creek." "Fancy dresser with a scarred face and 4 rough-looking types." Wilson glanced at Ruby. "Sounds like our visitors." Ruby's mouth went dry. "That's them." Victor nodded, his expression shifting to the focused determination of a man preparing for battle. "All right, everyone to their positions. Remember, we let them make the first move. No shooting unless absolutely necessary." The judge nodded and disappeared back outside. Reverend Taylor moved to stand near the altar, one hand resting casually near his concealed weapon. Victor turned to Ruby. "Stay here. Whatever happens, whatever he says, let me handle it." Ruby nodded, though they both knew she couldn't promise to remain silent if Frank began spinning his lies. Victor started for the door, then paused, turning back. In 2 quick strides, he returned to her side, bending down to press a swift, fierce kiss to her lips. "For luck," he murmured as he pulled away, leaving Ruby breathless and stunned. Before she could respond, he was gone, striding purposefully toward his position at the church door. The wait that followed seemed endless. Ruby could hear the distant rumble of the stage's approach, the creak of wheels and jingle of harnesses growing louder. Then the sounds of the stage stopping, men disembarking, voices raised in question and answer. And then silence. Ruby's hands trembled in her lap. She focused on her breathing, on the colored light playing across the altar, on the solid presence of Victor at the door and Reverend Taylor near the altar. She would not cower. Not this time. The church door opened slowly. Frank Blackburn stood in the doorway, elegantly dressed as always in a black suit and burgundy vest, his dark hair slicked back, the scar on his right cheek stark against his pale skin. His cold eyes found Ruby immediately, and the smile that spread across his face sent ice through her veins. "There you are, my dear," he said, his voice deceptively gentle. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Ruby remained seated, her back straight, her gaze unwavering even as her heart threatened to beat out of her chest. Frank took a step forward, only to find his path blocked by Victor, who moved with smooth efficiency to position himself between Frank and Ruby. "That's far enough, Blackburn," Victor said, his voice carrying easily in the church's acoustics. Frank's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened as they assessed Victor. "And you are Marshal Victor Keller. This is my town." The simple statement carried a weight of authority that even Frank seemed to recognize. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Your town, how quaint." He glanced past Victor to where Ruby sat. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Marshal. That woman is my property, and I've come to take her home." "I belong to no one," Ruby said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Especially not you, Frank." Frank's smile tightened. "Ruby, darling, you're confused. All this running, the stress of caring for a child alone, it's addled your thinking." He turned his attention back to Victor. "She's been unwell since the baby came. Postpartum melancholia, the doctor called it. Makes her say the most outlandish things." "That's a lie," Ruby said, rising from the pew. Everything he says is a lie. Victor didn't move from his position. Miss Ross has told me the truth, Blackburn, about the Golden Palace, about James, about how you've hunted her across 3 territories. At the mention of James, something dangerous flickered in Frank's eyes. James Parker was a thief who stole what was mine. He got what thieves deserve. He was twice the man you'll ever be, Ruby retorted, her fear giving way to anger, and his son will grow up knowing that. Frank's composed facade cracked slightly. His son, that child is mine, Ruby, mine by right if not by blood. The boy belongs with his mother, Victor interjected, and his mother has chosen to make her home here in Redemption Creek. Frank's gaze shifted between Ruby and Victor, his quick mind clearly assessing the situation. I see, he said after a moment, his voice dangerously soft. You found yourself a new protector. How? Predictable? He took a step back, surveying the church interior with calculated interest. Tell me, Marshal, does your entire town share your enthusiasm for harboring runaways? Or is your interest in Ruby more personal? Victor didn't rise to the bait. Miss Ross is under the protection of this town and its law. I suggest you get back on that stage and return to Helena. Frank laughed, the sound echoing unnervingly through the church. Law, don't be absurd. The only law that matters is the law of ownership, Marshal. Ruby is mine. The child is mine, and I've come to collect what's mine. The law says otherwise, came a new voice as Judge Wilson entered through a side door. A woman is not property, Blackburn, neither is a child. Frank's expression darkened as he recognized the judge. Wilson, should have known you'd be involved in this farce. No farce, Blackburn. Just justice, long overdue. The judge moved to stand near Ruby. Miss Ross has sworn a statement detailing your crimes: kidnapping, coercion, the murder of James Parker. The territorial marshal's office has been notified. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Frank's face. Her word against mine, and who do you think they'll believe? A respected businessman or a saloon singer with a bastard child? They'll believe evidence, Victor said calmly, the sworn testimony of multiple witnesses. The financial records Judge Wilson subpoenaed from your bank in Helena, showing payments to known killers on the day James Parker died. Ruby stared at Victor, then at the judge. She hadn't known about any of this, had no idea they had been building a case while preparing for Frank's arrival. Frank's confident demeanor faltered. This is absurd. You can't. We already have, Judge Wilson interrupted. The papers are filed. The investigation is underway. Your empire is crumbling as we speak, Blackburn. A tense silence filled the church as Frank processed this information. Ruby held her breath, watching the calculations play out behind his eyes. She knew him well enough to recognize the moment when he decided violence was his only remaining option. Frank, she said, drawing his attention back to her. It's over. Let it be over. His eyes blazed with sudden fury. It's over when I say it's over. His hand moved toward his jacket, and Ruby knew with terrible certainty that he had a gun concealed there. Don't, Victor warned, his own hand moving to his holster. Frank ignored him, a twisted smile forming on his lips as he began to withdraw the weapon. I always get what's mine, Ruby, one way or another. Several things happened at once. Victor drew his gun with lightning speed. Judge Wilson pulled Ruby down behind a pew. Reverend Taylor moved away from the altar, his own weapon appearing as if by magic. And from outside the church came the sound of gunfire, shouts, and chaos. His men, Ruby gasped, realizing what was happening. Frank had stationed his hired guns around the town, waiting for his signal. A shot rang out inside the church, the report deafening in the enclosed space. Ruby flinched, but the bullet splintered the wood of a pew several feet away. Frank's aim had been thrown off by Victor's quick response. Stay down, the judge ordered, pushing Ruby lower as more shots were exchanged. Through the gaps between the pews, Ruby could see Victor taking cover behind a pillar, returning fire with careful precision. Reverend Taylor had positioned himself behind the altar, his expression grimly determined as he watched for an opening. Frank had retreated to the doorway, using the heavy wooden door as a shield as he fired into the church. You can't keep her from me, he shouted between shots. No one can, Ruby's heart pounded in her ears, fear for Victor and the others overwhelming her own terror. This was exactly what she had dreaded, violence and bloodshed because of her desperate bid for freedom. The gunfire from outside intensified, then gradually began to diminish. Ruby prayed it meant that Victor's deputies were gaining the upper hand against Frank's men, not the other way around. A momentary lull fell inside the church. Ruby could hear Frank breathing heavily from his position by the door. "It's over, Blackburn," Victor called out. "Your men are down. Surrender now and you might live to see trial." Frank's laugh was edged with desperation. "You think I care about that, about living? All I care about is making sure Ruby pays for what she's done, for humiliating me." "The only one humiliated here is you," Ruby said, rising slightly despite the judge's attempt to keep her down. "Running across 3 territories after a woman who never wanted you in the first place." Frank's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful whore. After everything I gave you, you gave me nothing but fear and pain," Ruby interrupted, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Something shifted in Frank's expression, a terrible resolve settling over his features. "Then you're a fool," he said coldly. He lunged from behind the door, firing wildly toward where Ruby stood. She felt the judge pull her down again, felt the burn of a bullet grazing her arm as she fell. 2 shots rang out in quick succession, one from Victor's position, one from the altar where Reverend Taylor stood. Frank staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face as red bloomed across his pristine white shirt. He took one step forward, then another, his gun slipping from nerveless fingers. "Ruby," he gasped, his voice barely audible now. "You were mine." Then he crumpled to the floor, his blood staining the church's worn floorboards. For a moment, no one moved. The silence that followed the gunfire was absolute, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then Victor was there, kneeling beside Ruby, his hands gentle as they checked her for injuries. "Are you hit? Ruby, are you hit?" She shook her head, though the graze on her arm was beginning to sting. "Just a scratch, I'm all right." She looked past him to where Frank lay motionless. "Is he?" Victor nodded grimly. "He's gone." A strange numbness settled over Ruby. After all these months of running, of living in constant fear, it was over. Frank Blackburn was dead, she was free. The realization didn't bring the relief she had expected, only a hollow exhaustion and the beginnings of delayed shock. She began to tremble, her body processing what her mind couldn't yet accept. "Easy," Victor murmured, gathering her carefully into his arms. "Easy now, it's over, you're safe." Ruby leaned into his strength, grateful for the solid warmth of him as the trembling intensified. "Illy," she managed through chattering teeth, "I need to see Illy." "As soon as we're sure it's safe," Victor promised. "Let the doctor look at your arm first." From outside came the sounds of the town reasserting itself, voices calling out, footsteps approaching, the general murmur of people gathering after a crisis had passed. Dr. Morgan appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in one hand, his rifle in the other. His eyes widened as he took in the scene: Frank's body, the bullet holes in the church walls and pews, Ruby trembling in Victor's arms. "Marshal," he questioned, moving quickly inside. "Check Blackburn first," Victor instructed. Then Miss Ross, bullet grazed her arm. As the doctor knelt beside Frank's body, confirming what they already knew, Reverend Taylor approached, his gun now hidden away, his expression somber. "The Lord judges us all in the end," he said quietly. "May he have mercy on his soul." Ruby wasn't sure she could wish such mercy for a man like Frank, but she nodded anyway, too exhausted for anything else. Judge Wilson stood, dusting off his trousers. "I'll go see about the situation outside, make sure Blackburn's men are secured." After he left, Doctor Morgan came to examine Ruby's arm. The bullet had torn through her sleeve and left a shallow furrow across her skin, painful but not serious. As he cleaned and bandaged the wound, Ruby asked the question foremost in her mind. Did anyone else get hurt? Victor, who hadn't left her side, nodded grimly. "Peterson took a bullet to the shoulder. One of the Millers got grazed like you, but everyone's alive." Relief washed over her. No one had died for her sake, no one except Frank, whose death she couldn't bring herself to mourn. "Once, Doctor." Morgan finished with her arm. Victor helped Ruby to her feet. "Let's get you to Ellie," he said, understanding that nothing else would bring her comfort now. They walked slowly through the town, the aftermath of the gunfight evident in broken windows and bullet-scarred buildings. Townspeople stood in small groups, talking in hushed voices that quieted as Ruby and Victor passed. Some nodded respectfully, others offered small smiles of encouragement. The Cooper sisters' shop remained untouched by the violence, situated as it was on the far side of town. When they entered, both sisters rushed forward, their identical faces creased with worry. "We heard the shooting," Abigail said. "Is it over? Is everyone all right?" "It's over," Victor confirmed, "and everyone who matters is fine." "Illy?" Ruby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right as rain," Margaret assured her, leading them to the back room where Bea sat in a rocking chair, Illy cradled in her arms. The moment Ruby saw her son, whole and unharmed, the last of her composure crumbled. Tears she had been holding back for months, years, perhaps flowed freely down her cheeks as she gathered him close, breathing in his sweet scent, feeling his tiny heart beat against her own. "It's all right now," she whispered against his downy head. "We're free, my love, we're finally free." Victor stood nearby, his presence a comfort without being an intrusion. When Ruby looked up at him through her tears, she saw her own emotions reflected in his eyes: relief, exhaustion, and beneath it all, a steady, growing certainty. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Victor shook his head. "No need for thanks. I told you this town protects its own." Ruby smiled through her tears, holding Ellie with one arm while reaching out to Victor with the other. Without hesitation, he took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "And are we?" she asked softly. "Our own, truly," Victor's answering smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Yes, Ruby Ross," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for as long as you want to be." In that moment, with her son in her arms and Victor's hand in hers, Ruby knew that her long journey had finally reached its end. Not in California or some distant territory, but here in Redemption Creek, a place she had stumbled upon by chance, but would choose by design. A place where she could stop running. A place she could, at last, call home. The seasons turned, as they always do, bringing changes both expected and surprising to Redemption Creek and its newest residents. Summer faded into a glorious autumn, the cottonwoods along the creek turning to gold in the crisp October air. Ruby watched the transformation from the window of her new home, a small but sturdy cabin on the edge of town that Victor had begun building in the weeks following Frank Blackburn's death. "Not much to look at yet," he had said when he first showed her the partially constructed dwelling, "but it will be solid before the first snow, and there's room to add on as needed." The unspoken implication that their family might grow had brought a blush to Ruby's cheeks but a smile to her lips. Their courtship had progressed with a deliberate care that Ruby appreciated. Victor understood her need to heal, to find her footing in this new life before committing to another. He called on her properly at the boarding house, taking her for walks through town with Ellie in tow, bringing small, thoughtful gifts: a ribbon for her hair, a carved wooden rattle for Ellie, wildflowers gathered along his morning rounds. They spoke of everything and nothing: his childhood in Missouri before the war brought his family west, her early years in the mercantile business with her father, the books they had read, and the places they hoped to see someday. Each conversation built another bridge between them, another strand in the web of connection that was gradually becoming the foundation of something deeper. Ruby continued to help at the boarding house even as she took on other roles in the community. Her voice became a fixture in the church choir, her clear soprano leading hymns each Sunday. When the school teacher arrived in September, a young woman from back east with modern ideas and boundless enthusiasm, Ruby found herself helping with the younger children one afternoon a week, discovering a talent for education she hadn't known she possessed. And through it all, Victor remained steadfast, a constant presence, supportive without being suffocating, attentive without being possessive. He doted on Ellie, teaching the boy to smile at the sound of his voice, spending hours simply holding him while Ruby attended to other tasks. It was during one such moment, returning from choir practice to find Victor in the boarding house parlor with Ellie sleeping peacefully on his chest, that Ruby realized she had fallen in love with him. Not the desperate, consuming love she had felt for James, born of shared danger and the desire to escape, but something quieter, deeper, built on mutual respect and genuine understanding. The realization had terrified her at first. Loving meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had cost her dearly in the past. But as the weeks passed and Victor proved himself again and again to be a man of his word, Ruby's fear gradually gave way to acceptance, and then to joy. By November, with the cabin nearing completion and winter's first tentative snowflakes dusting the mountain peaks, Ruby knew it was time to take the next step. She invited Victor to supper at the boarding house, a private meal prepared by her own hands in Bee's kitchen after the other boarders had been fed. "This is delicious," Victor said, savoring the venison stew she had prepared using his own recipe, passed down from his mother. "Better than I've ever made it," Ruby smiled, pleased by the compliment. "Your mother would be proud of how well you taught me." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the occasional coo from Ellie, who watched from his cradle near the table. "The cabin will be finished next week," Victor said eventually. "Just in time, the almanac says we're in for an early winter." Ruby nodded, her pulse quickening. "It's beautiful, Victor. You've done a wonderful job." He looked up from his plate, his eyes serious. "It needs a woman's touch, though. Curtains, rugs, those little things that make a house a home." "I'd be happy to help with that," Ruby offered, knowing he was leading toward something more. Victor set down his fork, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Ruby, I've been thinking—" "Yes," she encouraged when he hesitated. "I've been thinking that I'd like you to help with more than just curtains and rugs." He took a deep breath. "I'd like you to be the one who decides where everything goes, what flowers to plant come spring, what color to paint the porch when the weather warms." Ruby felt tears prick at her eyes. "Are you asking me to live there with you, Marshal Keller?" "I'm asking you to marry me," Victor clarified, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "To make that cabin a home, our home. Yours, mine, and Ellie's." Joy bubbled up in Ruby's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Victor, I know it hasn't been long," he continued quickly. "And I know you've been through more than any woman should have to endure. I don't want to rush you. If you need more time, yes," Ruby interrupted, squeezing his hand. "Yes, I'll marry you, Victor Keller." The smile that broke across his face was like sunshine after storm clouds. He stood, pulling her to her feet and into his arms in one smooth motion. "I love you, Ruby Ross," he murmured against her hair. "Have since the moment I found you behind that church, holding your son like he was all the treasure in the world." Ruby pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "And I love you, Victor, for your kindness, your patience, your courage. For showing me what a good man truly is." His kiss was gentle at first, a tentative question that Ruby answered by rising on her toes to deepen it, her arms winding around his neck as his tightened around her waist. It was a promise, a covenant, a beginning. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked. "How soon can you be Mrs. Keller?" Ruby laughed, giddy with happiness. "As soon as Reverend Taylor can say the words. I've waited long enough for happiness, I think." They were married 2 weeks later in the same church where Frank Blackburn had met his end. The irony wasn't lost on Ruby, but it felt right somehow, a final reclaiming of her life, a transformation of a place of fear and violence into one of hope and new beginnings. The entire town turned out for the ceremony. Bee stood as Ruby's matron of honor, dabbing at her eyes throughout the service. Judge Wilson gave the bride away, his weathered face solemn with responsibility. Dr. Morgan served as Victor's best man, the two men having formed a close friendship during the months since the confrontation with Blackburn. And Ellie, now 7 months old and sitting up on his own, watched from Abigail Cooper's lap, occasionally babbling as if offering his own commentary on the proceedings. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Taylor declared, his voice carrying through the church. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Victor kissed his bride, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. Ruby felt the last shadows of her old life fall away, replaced by the bright promise of the future, a future with Victor, with Ellie, with the good people of Redemption Creek, who had become her family. The celebration continued at the Grand Hotel, where the proprietor had opened his dining room for a feast that would be talked about for years to come. There was dancing, laughter, toasts to the happy couple, and so much goodwill that Ruby felt almost overwhelmed by it. Happy. Victor asked as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. Ruby looked up at him, at the love shining in his blue eyes, and felt her heart might burst with joy. "More than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Later, as they prepared to leave for their new home, Bea approached with a sleeping Ellie in her arms. "I thought you might want the little one tonight in your new house," she said, "to start your life as a family proper." Ruby exchanged a glance with Victor, who nodded his agreement. They had discussed having Ellie stay with Bea for a night or two, giving them time alone as newlyweds, but the thought of all three of them spending their first night in the cabin together felt right. "Thank you," Ruby said, taking her son from Bea's arms. "For everything, Bea. I don't know what we would have done without you these past months." The older woman waved away her gratitude. "You've been a blessing to me too, child, and this little one," she patted Ellie's back. "You've given an old woman something to fuss over again." After a round of goodbyes and well wishes, Victor helped Ruby into the wagon he had borrowed for the occasion. With Ellie nestled between them, they set off for their new home, the stars emerging one by one in the clear winter sky. The cabin, nestled among pine trees just outside town, glowed with welcoming light. Victor had arranged for Judge Wilson and Dr. Morgan to go ahead and light the lamps and stoke the fire, ensuring the house would be warm when they arrived. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keller," Victor said, lifting Ruby down from the wagon, Ellie still sleeping in her arms. The simple words, spoken with such love and pride, brought tears to Ruby's eyes. Home. After all her running, all her fear, all her desperate searching for safety, she had found it here, not just in a place, but in the arms of a good man who loved her and her son with unwavering devotion. "It's perfect," she whispered as Victor carried her across the threshold, an old tradition he'd insisted upon. Absolutely perfect, and it was. The cabin was small but well built, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a bedroom for them, a smaller room for Ellie, and a covered porch that wrapped around two sides. Victor had furnished it simply but comfortably with pieces made by the town's carpenter, and a few treasures he'd collected over the years. But what made it truly perfect were the small touches. Ruby recognized curtains Bea had sewn from fabric Ruby had admired, a rocking chair like the one she used at the boarding house, a small bookshelf filled with volumes from the Cooper sisters' personal collection. The community had come together to make this place a home for them, just as they had come together months earlier to protect her and Ellie from harm. After settling Ellie in his new cradle, Ruby and Victor stood in the center of their home, arms around each other, the fire casting golden light over everything. "I never thought I'd have this," Ruby admitted softly. After James died, I thought the best I could hope for was survival. For Ellie and me to find some quiet corner where no one knew us." Victor stroked her hair, his touch gentle. And now, Ruby looked up at her husband, this man who had changed everything by offering help when she needed it most. "Now I know that survival isn't enough, that Ellie and I deserved more. That sometimes, if you're very lucky, the place where you stop running becomes the place where you belong." Victor's kiss was tender, filled with promise. "You belong here, Ruby Keller, you and Ellie both, now and always." As the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the pines outside, Ruby felt the truth of his words settle deep in her soul. She had finally found her redemption, not in escape or in vengeance, but in the love of a good man and the embrace of a community that had claimed her as their own. She was home, and she would never run again. Epilogue. 5 years later, the sound of laughter drew Ruby to the front porch of the cabin, now expanded to accommodate their growing family. From her vantage point, she could see Victor in the yard, Illy perched on his shoulders as they hunted for pine cones among the trees at the edge of their property. At 5, Illy had grown into a sturdy boy with his father's dark eyes and Ruby's curious nature. He called Victor Papa with the same devotion he might have shown to James, had fate been kinder. Watching them, Ruby's hand drifted unconsciously to her rounded belly, where their second child, a girl, she felt certain had recently begun to make her presence known with enthusiastic kicks. So much had changed in 5 years. Redemption Creek had grown from a modest settlement to a proper town with a new school building, a small hospital under Dr. Morgan's direction, and even a weekly newspaper run by the youngest Cooper sister, who had discovered a talent for journalism. Victor still served as marshal, though he now had 2 deputies to help with the expanded responsibilities. Ruby divided her time between teaching music at the school, leading the church choir, and caring for her family. The nightmares that had once plagued her had faded to rare occurrences, usually triggered by a chance reminder of her former life. Frank Blackburn's name was seldom mentioned, though Ruby knew the story was sometimes whispered among newcomers to town how the marshal had faced down a dangerous criminal to protect a woman and her child, how that same woman had gone on to become his wife. It was a romantic tale, simplified and polished in the retelling, with much of the fear and pain smoothed away. Ruby didn't mind. The truth lived in her memory and in Victor's, in the small scar on her arm and in the quiet moments when they spoke of those days. "Mama, look." Illy called, breaking into her thoughts. He wriggled down from Victor's shoulders and ran toward her, clutching something in his small hands. "Papa and me found a bird's nest. It was empty 'cause the babies already grew up and flew away, but Papa says they might come back next spring." Ruby bent down carefully, mindful of her condition, to examine her son's treasure. "It's beautiful, Illy. Where will you keep it?" "On my shelf with my special things," he declared. "Can I show Sarah?" Sarah was Judge Wilson's granddaughter, a year younger than Illy and his constant companion since the judge's daughter had moved to Redemption Creek following her husband's death. "After your nap," Ruby promised. "She and her mother are coming for tea this afternoon." Satisfied with this arrangement, Illy carefully set his treasure on the porch step before racing back to Victor, who had been watching the exchange with a smile. "Papa, can we find more nests, please?" "One more," Victor agreed. "Then it's nap time, partner. A deal's a deal." As they disappeared among the trees again, Ruby sank into the rocking chair Victor had made for her when they learned of her pregnancy. The steady motion soothed both her and the baby, especially on afternoons like this one, when the child seemed determined to practice dancing. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the terror of that day behind the church to the peace of this moment on her own front porch. Sometimes it seemed like a story that had happened to someone else, a tale she had read in one of the dime novels sold at the general store. But then she would catch a glimpse of herself in the mirror, would see the woman she had become, stronger, wiser, with lines of laughter forming at the corners of her eyes and a confidence she had once thought lost forever. And she would remember that every step of that journey, every moment of fear and courage, had been necessary to bring her to this place of belonging. Illy's laughter rang out again, followed by Victor's deeper chuckle. The sound wrapped around Ruby like an embrace, a reminder of all she had found when she finally stopped running. "You can stop running," Victor had said to her that day behind the church. Words that had seemed impossible then, a promise too good to be true, but he had been right. She had stopped running, had planted roots in this place with this man, among these people who had become her family in all the ways that mattered. And in stopping, in standing her ground, Ruby Ross Keller had found more than safety. She had found home.